Okay, we're recording. So, hello everybody, and hello Rachel.
Hello, Emily.
So, this is an Our Minds Work podcast. It's been a while since I've done one, as we've been doing a lot of podcasts with the Opportunity Group lately around the apprenticeship. So it's nice to get back on track a little bit with some of the topics that keep coming up for the workplace. So for those who don't know me, I am Emily Pearson, Managing Director at Our Minds Work. And this is a very old friend and colleague of mine, Miss Rachel Bishop. Rachel and I used to work together many moons ago when we were super young. You still look young, to be fair, but when we were super young, at a local council's drug and alcohol service for young people. And it was great fun. We loved it. We loved the job, working with the young people. But it brings us perfectly to why we're having this discussion today around safeguarding, because we've probably spent the past 15 to 20 years working a lot around safeguarding and the different roles we've done. So this is why I wanted to talk to you today, Rachel, because you are the safeguarding expert. And there's a few questions that I want to kind of get your opinion on and have a little bit of a chat about. But it would be good just to give a little bit of an introduction to yourself of, how you've got here and what you've been doing over the past 15 years.
No, absolutely. Thanks for that. It was good to talk about the many moons ago, wasn't it? Obviously worked with yourself quite a while ago. I've done quite a lot of jobs in terms of different areas of focus in safeguarding since then. So I've worked police, prison, youth offending, obviously the drugs and alcohol with children and young people. From that, obviously, kind of breached into, I think, the harder world of safeguarding in terms of more child protection in a primary school, child protection in a local authority, and kind of moved on from that in terms of career development to sort of head of safeguarding, dabbled with a bit of HR, more in the sort of safer recruitment side, which tied in naturally with what I think my role was. Recently worked for the NHS in a mental health trust, which was obviously a very different field, but very exciting to obviously bring that to, you know, my knowledge and skills and everything with that. And I've recently set up my own safeguarding consultancy business called RLB Consultancy. What that kind of does is focuses on any element of safeguarding in terms of training, review of materials, policy procedure, a hand-holding through things like inspections, audits, just anything in terms of safeguarding that needs a little bit of attention or may need some advice or guidance. And I'll do that with kind of any business really, but especially kind of around education, I think, is kind of the bulk of experience that I come with in terms of Ofsted, etc., with apprenticeships and employability. So I've kind of just tailed off from that and worked with a few different companies. So I would be involved with kind of any company from any background that wanted some support, really. And that's kind of brought me to today, really, Emily. Thank you.
Excellent. Lots of stuff there. And I think this has been, where safeguarding has been, it has always been around children and young people, and those policies and procedures and legal implications have always been extremely clear. They were drummed into us, weren't they? It was something that you knew inside out. You knew exactly what you needed to do, what you needed to look out for. But one of the things that I've found working in, especially workplace mental health over the past 5 years, has been organisations would only really have a safeguarding policy and procedure if they employed under 18-year-olds.
Yeah.
Yet over the past 5 years, as we've raised awareness around mental health in the workplace, we've opened the door to some discussions that have been happening, where it is turned to the point where employees are becoming vulnerable adults in the workplace. Those conversations are happening around suicide, and unfortunately companies don't have the policies and procedures there to make sure that people are supported. So what's the risks of this? I mean, we come across it all of the time, but what do you think the risks for employers are who don't have these robust safeguarding policies and procedures, specifically to safeguard the adults and employees in the workplace?
Absolute valid question, and I think it's the most pertinent, isn't it, that actually employers should be looking at these days. And I think with everything that's kind of come around in terms of, you know, more awareness around mental health and actually kind of putting the right sort of support in for people, especially adults, is just it's perfectly placed to kind of do that now, and for employers to take a check of their stock and think about how they're doing that. So for me, there's two main things. First of all, obviously, it is the significant harm that could come to some person, you know, whether that, exactly like you said, you know, it's really clear for children, but whether that be a child, whether that be an adult, it's absolutely, for me, I think because I've kind of worked across both, naturally it's just kind of become an instinct, and it's just become a procedure that I follow in my head. You know, I wouldn't go against any of my kind of morals and internal sort of drivers in terms of actually breaching confidentiality for an adult if I actually felt that they were at harm, because in that respect they then become part of that vulnerable group. And I like to say vulnerable groups rather than vulnerable adults, because I think it's just, it could be anyone in any situation, especially in the workplace. And how many workplaces have we been in where stress is such a huge factor? You know, we're expected to meet all of these deadlines, these targets, with COVID, with everything going on at the moment. I think that the first thing is absolutely it, and it's paramount. It's if some significant harm comes to a human being, that just can't happen, really. So what we need to do is do everything we can to stop that from happening, or at least reduce that risk. I think in terms of the second thing, it's about, and this is kind of in the years that I've done these jobs and come across different things, it's more around the reputational damage and the trust that's lost. I mean, how many people want to go to a business where they've heard bad things about them on the internet? You know, that's the first thing we do now as humans, isn't it? We check, we read the reviews, and we look at what we're getting for our money, or what we're getting even if something's free. We want to know we're getting the best service. And I think reputational damage is a very, very hard thing to come back from, especially if you're talking about the apprenticeships. You know, you can't kind of come back from that, actually. If you drop the ball with safeguarding, or if you fail in terms of safeguarding, you actually fail your inspection. So kind of some businesses actually result in closure because of this. So they're kind of the main things for me. And I think it's the fact that people kind of either are frightened of safeguarding, so they don't kind of want to touch that unless they've got someone who's deemed as an expert. But also on the second hand, it's about also being honest and open about that, and actually saying, well, we're doing the work on that, we've got this plan in place. And if you haven't got things like that, you know, these things can happen so quickly overnight. And that, those for me are kind of the main, you know, the main two risks. Obviously there's lots of smaller risks, but I think they're big enough, aren't they? Do you know what I mean? I think those alone, pretty much kind of cover it, don't they? So those are the two main factors for me, I suppose, Emily, in terms of risk.
Definitely, and I think that loss of life, it is paramount. Absolutely. And fortunately, safeguarding for children and young people works so well because it's very clear, it's very structured, everybody knows that they need to be doing the same thing. Yet this hasn't transferred over into the workplace, especially where we have a lot of employees who are now trained to be like mental health first aiders, without that infrastructure and policy and procedure to follow. You know, and from our Minds Work perspective, this is one of the reasons why, you know, we work so hard on designing a blueprint to help employers to actually put into practice best practice, you know, based on what we would do if it was an under 18. Those adults are still at risk when it comes to significant harm. And I think what potentially happens then, for if we think about a scenario just off the back of that point, where there's a mental health first aider, mental health champion, mental health advocate, and the employer doesn't have that clear policy and procedure and reporting mechanism in place, is if something goes wrong, and it's like, if this goes wrong, not only do we see the loss of life, but then potentially the person who was in the role to protect that life is left having to deal with the guilt of potentially not knowing how to have even save that life.
Which can sometimes result in another loss of life, Emily. I think it's really imperative that, you know, the work you do, which is why I took a massive interest in kind of what you guys were doing, is because actually this needs to happen. It's paramount that employers are actually looking at this and taking that responsibility on, and actually, you know, just putting the right things in place. And it's very easy to do, as you've said, if you follow best practice. You know, there's nothing different in terms of what you would do for a friend if you've got a kind of a feeling of risk and just think, well, actually that person's not okay. You'd pretty much do whatever you could. And I think that's the importance of having robust policies and procedures. And actually you can write them, and someone will come along and look at that and say, well, actually, yeah, this is brilliant practice. Yes, you may not have a legal or statutory obligation, but this is wonderful work, and this should be replicated throughout different businesses. So absolutely agree with you on that one.
Yeah, excellent. So, and this has been another kind of issue, is around employees that are now put into the roles of mental health first aiders, mental health advocates, champions, whatever you want to call them. They are literally put in the role to intervene when it comes to suicide. And some of the training courses, I'm not going to mention any names, but I can probably guess that anybody watching this who knows anything about what I've put in LinkedIn will know who I'm talking about. But there is training that we have come across that completely omits any responsibility for ensuring that people are really robustly trained in understanding risk, breaching confidentiality. How do you report it afterwards? There's no reporting mechanisms as well, so there's a failure there to, like you say, protect those people as well. So kind of, you know, what would you say? Because you're right, it is best practice, isn't it? There is no legal obligation for a workplace like an academy or any educational. They're offsteaded on those policies and procedures and making sure that everybody's trained, and this isn't happening in the workplace.
No. And there's no difference. Yes, I absolutely understand, you know, the child sort of adult issue. However, you know, what is different really when you think about it? Life is life, and loss of life is loss of life. And I think the worrying part is that we don't have these obligations, we don't have these legal, statutory, you know, legislative ideas that have actually been embedded for years and years and years, and it's something new, and it's something quite frightening. So actually, why would you not do everything you can? If you want to run a business to the best of your ability, what you would do is you'd be looking at what other people do, you'd be looking at the best, you know, product out there on the market. So what's the difference? Why wouldn't you do that in terms of best practice with safeguarding? Why wouldn't you want all of your staff who come and work for you to actually really want to work there? We spend a lot of time in these workplaces, you know, predominantly some people spend more of their life actually in the workplace than they do at home. And actually now, I mean, you know, we're at home. It's a different time, isn't it? And I think it's just adapting to that, and even more now than ever, you know, a lot of the training that I've been kind of reviewing lately and working with different organizations in a very short time is just kind of getting the word out there and talking about, you know, the now, which is absolutely something we're adapting to, but how are you going to pick up on those things that you can't see in the office on a day-to-day basis? How are you going to have these conversations with a staff member sat, you know, in their flat or in their home, you know, kind of sat there, and you're that first aider? I mean, the pressure's immense. You know, I've not done a designated safeguarding role since COVID hit. I've done it remotely, absolutely, but always kind of as a head of, and it was always the people that were face to face and on the ground. I have done it over telephone, you know, I've done all of that, and I think the risks are harder to spot then, aren't they? So actually something like this, why are we not trying to put best practice in place, but also going above and beyond for that? Also looking at, well, it doesn't really cost anything to put safeguarding measures in place unless you're kind of getting a little bit of consultancy, and that's kind of usually an interim thing you put aside. It's a huge budget, but all you need is a person who's dedicated to the role, who lives, sleeps and eats and breathes safeguarding, as you know, yourself and I did, and we championed in other roles. and actually kind of dedicating yourself to that, giving yourself the time to read all of these resources around mental health, you know, what is best practice. And nothing's different for me, Emily, if I'm quite honest with you, and I've said this my whole career. It doesn't really change for me. I'd always, as a professional, do this. You know, safeguarding, it's very kind of, it's not sketchy for me. It is what it is. And if somebody's life is at risk, then I follow my procedure. End of. I just follow the safeguarding procedure, and therefore the only additional work you're then having to do is kind of more awareness around mental health and how we work with people, and you know, the fantastic resources that are out there about kind of listening with non-judgmental, you know, active listen skills. You're actually speaking to that person, you're asking the question, and you're brave enough to ask that question, knowing that you might possibly get a really brutal answer. And actually, what do you do then? Well, then your policy kicks in. And what you do is, if you've got a good organisation around you where you know that policy and procedure, one, you know who your leads are and you can go to them. If you're the lead, you go into kind of action mode and you say, right, well, we'll remove whatever's there. Is there an imminent risk? You know, what's kind of around that person? Does someone need to wait with them? Do you need to call someone? It's around getting those skills to then try and, I suppose, coax some kind of consensual agreement out. You know, is there a safety plan in place? Is this happening, you know, in the past? You know, all of these factors and all of these vulnerability factors, people need to be aware of, and that only comes with good training. Do you know what I mean? Like what yourselves are doing, it's kind of preparing that employer to then move forward. And what is it? The course, you know, the course gives you everything you need. It gives you the tools, and actually that's all you need, because then you can build on that. You can work with different organisations, you can see what they're doing. And if you're not kind of doing those things, I mean, breaching confidentiality for adults, for me, is always slightly different, yes. And you know, I'm echoing kind of the conversation we've just had, but it isn't any different. You know, if that person's at risk, what do? You kick in and you do what needs to be done. And if you have to breach that confidentiality, you also need the support, like you'd said. You know, you need to be supported by your organisations to be having these difficult conversations, and actually sometimes really brutal conversations, actually things you're seeing, things you're witnessing, and we all need that. You know, who wants to work for an organisation that doesn't care about their staff? That for me is the most concerning part. And education system are quite good at safeguarding adults from what I've kind of witnessed. They have the right, but again, they follow the same procedures. You know, they don't tail away from that, really.
And I think that's the difference, isn't it? The workplace haven't had that embedding yet. We've opened the doors to having these discussions, which have led to those discussions happening, but nobody knows quite what to do with it.
100%.
And I think, you know, it's the support for the person dealing with it afterwards, like you just said. Like, how many times I've had to breach confidentiality over the years, and some of them are just perfect. You know, you're contacting the right people, you're putting a safety plan in place, and everything works the way it should. Then there are times where it is just an awful situation. The person doesn't want you to breach confidentiality. They're frightened because they've got children at home that they then think are going to be, you know, end up in the social care system. And I've had people run out of where we were, so having to call police to try and do welfare checks, find people, keep people safe. So then it's the after impact of all of that as well. You know, who's reporting this stuff so that it's monitored, and there's aftercare given to people, it's reviewed, do we do the right thing? You know, all of the stuff that we would do in children and young people services needs to be transferred into that workplace.
100%.
So then for any HR people who will probably be the people who will be listening to this, you know, what are your 3 kind of top tips for implementing safeguarding in the workplace?
Well, they're pretty basic, to be honest, and you know, there's no kind of secret. It's just doing these 3 things works. I think is kind of the main thing. So first of all, my first top tip would be to hire or invest because I do see it as a real investment, in a designated safeguarding lead that has been on a designated safeguarding lead training course, you know, a decent one, a good one, but also one that kind of doesn't just look at children. You've got to think about your staff members, exactly as you've said. So for instance, the one that I've kind of been designing lately, I've brought them together because I can't write them separately, you know what I mean? And that's kind of the vibe that I want to give off, because you're looking at allegations against staff, you're looking against lots of different factors for that. So it's all of those. So yeah, for me, it's absolutely having that designated safeguarding lead in place, giving them the time and the resources, and I suppose a little bit of the funding to do something with what they've been given. So there's your job description, what you're going to achieve. You know, it's got to be strategic, it's got to be senior, it's got to have that authority to it, it's got to have the opportunity to reach people, do you know, and actually embed something. So I've worked with a lot of organisations with fantastic policies and procedures. The problem being is that it's not implemented or embedded effectively, and that's wherein it lies the issue. And I think, you know, accessing local authority things, you know, your serious case reviews, looking at your local safeguarding children's and adults boards, it's about looking at current legislation, making sure you're getting the right sort of alerts. So all that takes time. So it's actually quite a heavy role, and I think a lot of HR people do take on that role, whereas, you know, it's not really got the time to sort of dedicate to that. I think it's an absolute must in itself. And I know that's not feasible for some organisations to kind of create an entire role, but at least, you know, having a few days where you can actually sit down and do some of the groundwork, that's what's effective. That is the biggest top tip that we can have. Someone that's continuously developing their sort of awareness, their skills and their knowledge, and imparting that on other people. And actually, you know, that you can trust them. Do you know what I mean? It's really important. I think as, so, you know, like a board member or any kind of executive that will usually hold the lead responsibility for safeguarding within that organisation, it's about having trust in that person to actually, one, deliver, two, give the intervention, and three, actually, that you can go home and you can sleep at night. It's not about what needs to be done tomorrow. It's about, well, that was done today, because how many times did we leave it? And then, you know, the next day, guarantee that issue will happen on the evening. Do you know what I mean? And it's all of your action plans, having a, you know, robust stuff around the prevent duty. Safeguarding encompasses all of that for me. That's why I kind of don't really talk about them in kind of, you know, difference between each other. I think it's more around just saying mental health as well, suicide, it all falls under the safeguarding bracket, and that's kind of what I've always worked at, and that's done me a lot of good. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of not done me wrong anyway so far, touch wood. Secondly, I'd say training, like I've just said, in terms of very specific training for all of your staff, for all of your volunteers, for your board members, for anybody that comes into contact. Whatever you can be doing for learners, if it's an education establishment, you know, whatever you can be doing for any kind of customer, and making sure that everybody gets a good induction. Training's revisited, you know, at specific times to make sure that people are actually getting the message, but then kind of continuing that. How many jobs have we had where you get it at the beginning and then kind of not talked about for a bit, and you're a bit like, oh, that was interesting. So it's making that paramount, isn't it? It's making sure, and I think you've got to look at training for like interim staff, things like that as well. There's subcontractors. I've worked in an organisation which was fantastic actually, and I had to actually audit the subcontractors in terms of a safeguarding and prevent and equality and diversity audit, and it was fantastic because what it did was it streamlined and aligned the processes and policies and procedures with ours, you know, as the big entity. So actually when you do get audited or you do get inspected, it kind of like follows through with a golden thread through everything. They're getting, you know, a really good free consultation, do you know what I mean, of actually what they could then put in place for themselves, because some of these places were, you know, like warehousing or whatever, where health and safety features is a very, very important thing. Well, safeguarding's exactly the same. It carries the same weight. It's just not, you know, a legal requirement. Again, just wanted to sort of finally finish on the training part, is about promoting a culture of vigilance. That for me is the most important imperative thing that anyone should be doing in a business if they've got this kind of role. They are promoting that culture. Who doesn't want to work in a positive culture? Do you know what I mean? And who doesn't want to work in who doesn't want to actually be in a place where you can kind of look around and people will notice if you're not okay? Do you know what I mean? That's so important. We want our friends and families to notice if we're not all right. You know, what's the difference with a colleague if actually you've got that trust and you can have that conversation, and then staff will then have a culture of vigilance in whatever they're doing with a customer, you know, coming across that and saying, hang on a minute, something's not right here. I'm either going to ask the question because this person's coming across as very, very down, very low, you know, they've kind of mentioned suicide and I feel competent enough to do that. I mean, that's fantastic. That's the ideal world, isn't it? And in terms of sort of it's my third top tip. I'd say that it's around sort of regular audit. Either whether you do that with a senior leader in the business who has some kind of level of, you know, expertise in safeguarding, or have done, you know, a lot of training, they might have done it in their past or whatever, or they've always kind of been the DSL in different organisations. I think it's good to have that scrutiny. I can put my hand up and say it's fantastic when, you know, the likes of Ofsted consultants come in and do a bit of quality consultancy. I like to be scrutinised. I like to know what's kind of going on with my staff, when sometimes I didn't have the opportunity to go out and see them when they were all over the UK. Do you know what I mean? It's something that they can do in terms of observation. It's a fresh pair of eyes. It's the first thing that you do, you know, when you're going to get inspected. The audit is really important. And actually sometimes hiring somebody from a different organisation, or, you know, a consultant who could actually take a look and say, I really like what you're doing here. It's fantastic. You can sleep at night. Or actually, I'd maybe really look at this, or actually this is horrific, this risk is so high, let's put something in place right now. And that's imperative for businesses, to have that hand holding, to have that, you know, comfortable blanket around them, that they're not alone and they're not just having to do this alone. And that's the point, isn't it? It's working across loads of different organisations to get a feel of what's wrong in organisations like you're doing, and saying, well, this is wrong and this needs to change, and we can help you go through that process. So it's always good to know someone, I think, who can offer you something. For instance, I have a fantastic ex-colleague who has done a lot in terms of quality consultancy, and she's the first person I go to. Do you know what I mean? In terms of, if I'm not quite sure on something, which none of us are experts, you know, we try and be as much as we can, but it's about having those good networks around you. So the likes of yourselves, you know, it's talking about different services that you can go to and say, can you maybe take a look at our policies and procedures? Can you maybe have a look at our action plans, risk assessments? And then actually, when you've got that counsel and guidance, you feel a little bit safer. So I think for me, it's definitely probably one of the most important things, but definitely my third tip.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, there's some really excellent tips there. And, you know, some of the industries that we know have the highest levels of suicide, for example, construction industry, lose more of their employees every year than they do to kind of trips and falls. So we know that suicide is happening, and we also have seen an increase in suicides actually taking place in the workplace as well. So we know this stuff's happening. It's only going to get worse. I think you're right. Now is the time for employers to seriously, or HR, to go away tomorrow in the office, take a look at your policies and procedures, see if you've got a safeguarding policy and procedure there, and if it's not, to contact yourself. We'll put a link in the video, and get that up and running for them, because I think it's a place where, if an organisation is planning on putting in mental health first aiders, advocates, champions, that's the first thing that they should have in place, and everything should follow after that.
And it's easy done with that, Emily. Do you know, it's about putting that there, embedding it, making sure you keep revisiting it. And actually it's as simple as that. If it's done well, it will create a better environment for an employer, for staff. It will attract the right people. It'll attract the right colleagues. You know, it'll keep that going. And you look at, you know, retention statistics and everything, and it's how many people have left a job, do you know what I mean? Because they're unhappy, or it's kind of them impacted on their life as well. So it's an obligation, really, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, they do it with physical health. So if if you breach confidentiality because somebody's in physical pain and ring an ambulance, which to me is breaching confidentiality on a need-to-know basis, you have to then go back and fill in an incident report form and HSE collect all that data. So I think if we really want mental health parity in the workplace, this is definitely best practice that companies need to get on board with. And I think this should have been being pushed years ago.
Absolutely.
And we've been pushing it for the past 4 years. I just think people are a little bit slow on getting on top of it. But then again, I don't blame the employers because it's not classed as a legal requirement. There's no guidance for them to do it. They need experts like yourself and I to actually come in and say, okay, if you were going to do this, this is what you need. If you're opening the door to these conversations, but you know, you need it more than ever. Yeah. Excellent. Sure. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Will you send me your details and we'll put them in the little box below?
I certainly will. Thank you so much for it. It was brilliant. Thank you.
Lovely. See you later.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.